Welcome back to another episode of the Evoke cast. I'm Scott Johnston, your co-host for today. I'm joined today by Vince Paikowski. Vince is another one of the amazing coaches here at Evoke Endurance that I'm lucky to work with. While Vince heads up the military training side of Evoke, he also comes into this with a very impressive running background, having run NCAA Division I cross country and track, and now delves in ultra distance running events. But most interestingly for me and for you today is that Vince shares my passion for deep dives into training theory and methodology. So today he and I are going to delve into what we're calling this episode Strength Training for the Endurance Athlete, with a focus on muscular endurance training. Now, there's an extensive body of knowledge on the use of strength training for sports that spans many decades. Some of it comes from science and some from coaches. But the origin of much of this knowledge that we have in the West today comes from or came out of the Soviet bloc, where their sports science and approach to coach education was far more advanced than in the West during the 60s and all the way up until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Before that, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had been little bits and pieces of Soviet training methodology that kind of, for several sports actually, that leaked out, much of it not in English. But after 1991, the floodgates opened and a lot of new material became available in English. And several of the most prominent Soviet figures in sports training moved to the West and began to work with different countries' sports federations. So much of what we know in the West today and what we consider strength training methodology came out of the USSR. And it was understood to have a broad application across virtually all sports performance, which I think is something that we in the endurance world, and especially in the ultra endurance sports, tend to not grasp fully or not appreciate enough. And that's what Vince and I are going to talk about today. We're going to unpack some of my history with strength and muscular endurance training before taking a deep dive into this fantastic, or what I think is a fascinating topic. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for joining us. So welcome, Vince. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for having me. I'm super excited for today. I just for those of you that kind of don't know my background started in collegiate running as an NCAA Division I athlete. And strength training was always kind of like this black sheep discussion or like this afterthought, unfortunately, in our program. And so it was always like, what can we do to get more aerobically and anaerobically fit? And unfortunately, we neglected so much of like the strength apparatus. And it wasn't until really post-collegiately that I found, just what these things can add to your capability and your ability. And on your note of us being the nerds of the company, I was actually on a call yesterday with an athlete. And he had a question that was like, does everybody at Evoke Endurance kind of coach their own way, or do you have like an applied methodology, or, how does that work? And I think what's super cool is in that moment, it was like, well, there's a methodology behind what we do, and we're all on the same sheet of music with it. And that methodology is, the aerobic system is the king system through which everything else can get expressed. Your speed at your second lactic threshold can identify or be the dictator of overall capability of expression. But the limiter to that expression, as we'll talk about today, is your muscular endurance. And from a muscular perspective, are you able to match that capacity that your engine has from a chassis perspective? And if not, then you're going to leave performance on the table, and you're not going to be able to really, express your full potential as an athlete. And so I think it's those three things together that are our underlying kind of framework through which we build training. And it's pretty exciting to also note that, everyone here at Evoke is on board with that methodology, and we're moving along that line to help athletes get as good as they possibly can.
Yeah, and I think, we've spoken, or I have, and I think most of us have spoken and written and exhaustively about kind of the metabolic side of this, the aerobic engine side, and maybe we've been a little lax in our presentation on why this the strength side or the muscular endurance side is plays such a big role, and so yeah, we're gonna go down some rabbit holes today. So buckle up, everybody. Here we go.
Yeah, let's start maybe with some of the anecdotal side of the house and kind of talk, Scott, from your perspective. Where was like the first encounter with muscular endurance, and how did you kind of get exposed to this idea that there might be something more than just aerobic ability going on in terms of performance?
Yeah. Well, I think, playing around with it, having been a lifelong athlete myself, and when I was a young swimmer, and I was swimming at quite a high level, part of a Olympic development program, and we used a lot of strength training in swim training, even back in the 70s. I think it was understood there that muscular endurance was a big limiter to performance in swimming. And so I had that background, but without any real formal education around it or understanding. But I did begin to notice, as a climber, a mountaineer, that moving uphill with a heavy pack, that the legs became the limitation in that. And so it really made me start thinking, okay, why is that? If aerobically or someone's very fit, but you can feel it in your muscles. And I think most endurance athletes have experienced this. But later, as I began to coach cross-country skiing, um, I needed to educate myself. I know I've talked a bit about that, my history of taking on a role as a coaching a cross country ski team, and then after I volunteered, realizing, oh my God, I don't really know much about this. I don't know much about the theory of training. I knew how to train or how I had trained, some of which was wrong. And so I did a deep dive into kind of training theory, and in that process, I ran across the kind of the two pillars of, I think, this kind of training, the information that came from a former Soviet coach named Yuri Verkhoshansky, and also the famous Italian running coach Renato Canova, both of whom discussed this concept. And it was the first time I'd ever really heard or read the formalized approach to this. Like, here's why this stuff is important. Here's why it works and how it works. And both of them had, trained extensively with these kinds of concepts and seen really good results with it. And my first chance to put this into play was coaching and helping a friend of mine get ready for the '92 Olympics. And we, at that point, stumbled across a Soviet speed skating training program, like a strength training program that we didn't understand at the time, that was what we are now referring to as muscular endurance. And because at that time, cross country skiing had gone through a transition technically from only the classic diagonal stride technique to incorporating what's known as skating. And it looked very much like speed skating. So we thought, well, why don't we look at what speed skaters are doing for training, since we're going to be skating on our skis? And that's when we stumbled on this Soviet method. And we used this ourselves. And I was actually training with this guy. And it was very much like our gym muscular endurance program that we've put together over the past, many years. And we did this muscular endurance routine, that, again, the speed skating one. And my friend, dominated the tryouts that year, was one of, obviously went to the Olympics, had a great season. But I, that fall, went on a climbing trip, and I was amazed at how strong I felt. I just couldn't believe the difference. And I'd been training my whole life, and all of a sudden could feel that I was at a different level. So I knew that this had a pretty big effect, and I just didn't. So that was in the early '90s. So since then, I've been able to kind of think about it more from a theoretical standpoint and figure this out. And the kind of the combination. We often try. And I think people who've heard me say this before. Our understanding of the physiology of exercise and training is pretty. The way we can understand it is we have to compartmentalize. We talk, okay, well, here's the aerobic engine side of it, and okay, here's the neurological or the strength side of it. And we compartmentalize those when we speak about them. But in reality, these things are, inextricably linked and dependent on one another. But it's so complex that we, for my simple brain, need to separate them into these sort of artificial constructs. So we're going to do that a bit today, talk, kind of on the metabolic side and then on the neurologic side. So we're going to separate those two. Um, but as that I took that experience then in 1995 when I was headed off to climb K2, and I had a business going and I was really busy. And so I didn't have a lot of time to train. So I focused on this type of training before I went to K2, just because it was very time efficient. And I was really strong on the mountain. So I thought, okay, this is working the way I thought it was. And then I began to apply it to my younger cross-country skiers that I was coaching. And again, saw tremendous results after, I was just sort of I was grasping at straws, trying different ideas, having kids, not these weren't kids, young adults, skating uphill with a heavy pack on their back with no, or not using their poles and putting a huge load on their legs, and then having them come to me after races and say, my legs never got tired of that race. And so I knew I was onto something here, but I just didn't know, hadn't formalized the ideas. So that's really kind of the genesis of this for me, where it came from.
Yeah. I think there's a few really interesting notes in there for the people listening right now. And the first one that I take away from that is, in training theory, in training as a whole, oftentimes we get this vernacular going of like, oh, we need ultra marathon fitness or ski fitness or tactical fitness. And they become all these like different things, and people look for novel solutions to how to crack these eggs. But really what we're getting after is we don't need to reinvent any wheel out there. We apply like a known literature, a known anecdote to a known problem, and we can see improvement across different sports because the body doesn't know, from an internal mechanism, the difference between when you're skiing and running. It just knows stress and strain, and how we train for that adaptation on stress and strain doesn't really differentiate between sport itself. And so we can apply these things from skiing or from mountaineering to the trails or to a different aspect and see a similar result and kind of play with it. And I think in that, there's an even more interesting conversation of the science often catches up to the anecdotal evidence. And I think so often we say like, oh, that evidence is just anecdotal in that group of athletes, right? And then years later, the science starts catching up that way. I think that's where, zone two, the science didn't catch up to, a lower aerobic style of training being an indicator for great performance until after we had seen the anecdotal evidence that that is what athletes were actually doing. And then science comes along and says, wait a second, let's try and figure out the mechanism that's going on behind this so we can understand it more. But it's almost always, at least in my experience, that the anecdotal evidence leads this development of science. Is that kind of what you take away as well, Scott?
Absolutely. I've said this multiple times, and I think some people will infer from that we're sort of anti-science. But my experience is, yeah, absolutely. The coaches and athletes lead the way. And then, years later, the scientists come along and explain why this works. But in many people's minds, it's not validated until there's some sort of peer-reviewed study. They think, well, that's just anecdotal. But think about when we're talking about peer-reviewed studies, there's no more demanding laboratory study than the field of competitive athletics. I mean, you've got thousands of coaches, millions of athletes trying different methodologies, and in the end, the stopwatch tells what was effective. And, whereas in a scientific study, you might have, a dozen athletes for a few weeks doing a certain thing. And then you try to extrapolate from this small group to a bigger picture. And I honestly think that's sort of ass backwards because, we've already got the laboratory out there. It's the competitive arena. And eventually, we may not understand, coaches might not understand why this stuff is working. But if you see it working and you modify, there's sort of an evolutionary process in training theory and training methodologies where good ideas get refined and changed and tried different ways. And you evolutionarily over decades of thousands of people doing this, you go, okay, that works. Let's, we don't care why. We just know that this works. And Whereas when we come at it from the science side, the laboratory side, we have these very, very, I understand, science has to be very controlled in order to arrive at a conclusion. So you can only really look at one metric, which is, and one of my pet gripes has always been, okay, they're going to use VO2 max as a determinant for athletic performance because it's something that's relatively easy to measure in a laboratory. So they can take these, 24 athletes and for 6 weeks have them do this kind of training and then see what happens to their VO2 max and go, whoa, look at that. But again, that's such it's a petri dish. It's a tiny little study group for a very short period of time. And oftentimes, as I've talked about before, they may just be picking some random college students to do this study on. They're not talking about well-trained athletes so I really think that when we look at where training methodologies come from, they're not coming out of the laboratory. They're coming from the coaches and athletes that are trying this stuff. And in my particular experience with where I really noticed this playing out, and I'd experienced it as a young person myself, but I didn't understand it. When I was coaching these young skiers, several of whom went on to the Olympics. I'd have him do the intervals, classic interval workouts like, everybody does. Okay, we're going to, ski up this hill, 5 times hard, and come back, glide back to the bottom, try to do it over again. And what I would notice is that each repetition, they would get less distance up the hill. And we'd also see lower heart rates. So I began to think, well, what's going on here? Well, that's when I really to pieces began. By that time, I'd done all this studying of Canova and Verkhoshansky and other coaches. The Coes, Peter Coe and Sebastian Coe had used this same kind of training during Sebastian Coe's reign as probably one of the best middle distance runners ever. I thought, well, their legs are giving out. So they can't get as far up the hill because their legs are becoming fatigued. And as a consequence, and since the heart is responding to the demand of the muscles, you see the heart rate would be dropping on each subsequent repetition. So I thought, well, what if we strengthened their legs? What if we increased the muscular endurance in their legs? Then we would get the kind of the cardiovascular response that we're looking for too, because each repetition they would be able to, maintain more power in it and get the same distance up the hill, and we'd see higher heart rates. So the heart would be getting the training effect that we're looking for. And so I started having my skiers in the off season and early season do this kind of muscular endurance training that you and I are going to eventually get to talking about. And then when we entered that traditional interval training period, they could get better results from the interval workouts. They didn't
Yeah.
fatigue as much in those interval workouts. So that was, I think, the first time I had a chance to do my own little, study of a bunch of, I was coaching about 15 teenage athletes at that time.
And I think that feeling is universal to people that have done sport on the trail or at a long distance or been on a mountain for a long time. This loss of speed with a decline in heart rate, but an increase still in your relative perceived exertion or your RPE is a clear-cut indicator that your muscles are the limiting factor to what is occurring right now. And the recruitment specifically of your muscles has decreased to such a point that you can't even garner enough capability from your body to the point where your aerobic system has to deliver oxygen because your muscles are in short failing you. And that's why the RPE still feels super high. It's still super uncomfortable because the muscles are spasming at some low level that is causing stress and strain on your body, but not from an aerobic system. And that's where I think it's super interesting when you brought up these as discrete problems and also continuous problems is a super important point to hammer home. When we talk aerobic training, we are largely talking a metabolic response. When we're talking strength training, we are talking a neurological response. But there is an overlap and these systems assist one another. And so and we'll head, I think, that direction now. But I think before we do that, let's just define quickly the problem we're trying to solve. And I think that problem that we just discussed that we're trying to solve is we want to improve endurance capacity of our fast twitch fibers, which we'll talk about here soon, or our muscular system that are the limiters to endurance. Because if these fibers fatigue, you will slow down, point blank, period, full
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah.
And so we are trying to get after how do we train these muscles in the gym to be as effective as possible, or on the trail to be as effective as possible, and what's a glide path we can kind of use to get there.
And I think one of the most impactful statements when I was in this sort of learning process of trying to figure some of these things out, was reading something that Renato Canova had read or had written, which was I mean, for a long time, sports science has known and coaches have known that the speed, as you mentioned in our opening, Vince, is that the speed at the second threshold is the single biggest determinant of endurance performance. It's almost a perfect correlation. And when we say second threshold, we can refer it. There's a lot of different names for this, but it would be the anaerobic threshold, the maximum lactate steady state, lactate threshold number two, a ventilatory threshold number two. There's all these different names. We all know what it means. It's basically the maximum power you can put out for an extended period of time. And if we measure that, it correlates almost perfectly with way better correlation than things like VO2 max to performance. So Canova was saying that he was repeating, this is the single biggest limitation to or the single best predictor of performance is the speed at the second threshold. And then here comes the punchline: the single biggest limitation to that speed at the second threshold is muscular endurance. That as the muscles fatigue, you can no longer maintain that high rate of speed. So as you just said, the problem we're trying to solve, Vince, here with this type of training is how can we make the muscles more fatigue resistant so that you can maintain this high speed for longer. And when we get into the muscle fiber discussion, I think that's going to help illuminate and illustrate some of these ideas more closely, or more. Yeah, we talk about muscle fiber and the recruitment of those muscle fibers. I think that'll help people.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think, but before marching on, let's just define a few terms when we throw these things around. I think we start from the left side and we work to the right side, and that muscular endurance itself doesn't exist in like a vacuum. And I think that's where sometimes we get it wrong in training methodology, thinking that muscular endurance is just its own thing. It is a representation of other work that kind of props it up. And so in that, I think first let's define when we talk strength training, we are talking the ability to produce a maximum force. So, for those of you listening, when you hear us talk strength training, that is your ability to produce a 1 rep or a 3 rep max on something. That is your overall ability to just output a amount of force in your body. Then you move towards power along the spectrum, and power is now your ability to replicate or output that strength, but in a manner where speed is the primary factor. So when we talk power, we are talking, you can think of it as bar velocity in the gym, or you can think of it as a faster output. You're starting to talk about an explosive measure, but you're translating that ability to recruit a large amount of force into something that's applicable to sport, which is usually power. There are very few sports in which strength itself is enough. Even all the way to football, you can see like a defensive lineman has an enormous amount of strength, but if they don't have explosive power to get off the line, then they're just going to get absolutely blown off of their seat by the guy across from them. So we have to develop strength. Then we have to develop a way to illuminate that strength, and that's power. And once we have power, though, we're still not down our line of progression. Then we arrive at muscular endurance, which is now how often can my muscles reproduce power to a meaningful degree over time. And so it's no longer what is my max velocity at a certain weight, but now it's how often can I move that weight repetitively. And that becomes a function of how much strength reserve do I have? What is my ability to produce that strength in a meaningful way, power? And then how long can I do it is muscular endurance. And so those things are all linked when we talk about strength methodology. You can't have a phenomenal muscular endurance athlete that is incredibly weak from a strength perspective. Because if so, their total output would be so low that their ability to reproduce anything meaningful would be much lower as a percentage of that 100%. So by raising all of these things over time, we can get a better effect. But that leads us to muscular endurance, and I'll kick it to you, Scott, I think, to define exactly what muscular endurance is and what we'll be discussing moving forward.
Well, this is great. Thank you for that explanation. I think that really helps people maybe put a picture together in their mind. I think of muscular endurance as the it's where the aerobic capacity and the strength side of this spectrum we're talking about meet one another, where they come together. And so it's the ability to reproduce a relatively and I'm talking about what relative means here, a relatively high proportion of your maximal force or power for a long period of time. And now those are rather vague terms, but that's important to understand that this idea of muscular endurance comes into play in almost every sport. There are very few sports where some level of endurance isn't required. We can get away from the power sports like, high jump or shot put and things like that, which really are not pertinent to this discussion today. But when we talk about any kind of an event or activity that lasts more than just a couple of minutes, we are talking now about an endurance sport. And all of a sudden, muscular endurance, the ability to recreate that high level of force or high level of power for a long duration of time. And by long, so we can talk about a 100-mile race. Well, that's going to have a component of muscular endurance built into it. It's a relatively, because it's so long, it's a long duration, and there's many thousands, if not millions, of repetitions that are going to occur during that 100-mile race. The relative proportion of the maximum force, maximum strength, or maximum power is going to be quite low. But then we could be talking about, let's say, hard rock climbing, where that maybe there's a 10-move crux. Well, you still need muscular endurance to get through this 10-move crux, but it's going to be quite a high percentage of your maximum force. So this is one of the reasons that a sport like rock climbing, there's a lot of training of strength and power because you need a high the ability to produce high forces and high power in a sport like that. Whereas, in a sport like ultra running, it's kind of at the opposite end of this endurance spectrum from something like hard rock climbing, is the maximum amount of force doesn't need to be ultra runner doesn't need to be as strong, let's say, relative to their as a rock climber does, because in their event, the amount of force that they need to generate over all those hours is relatively low. And so people can think of these sports as existing along this spectrum. All of them have some component of muscular endurance built into them. It's just the muscular endurance is going to be have a higher reliance on strength in short duration sports than it is in really long duration sports. And as you said, and I think maybe we're using if I make the mistake of saying strength, as you pointed out very very articulately, is that really that power is what we're after as an athlete. I mean, strength, I think of strength training as a little bit like the aerobic base. If you have a big aerobic base, you're going to be able to do a lot of things on the endurance world. If you have a big strength base, then it's going to give you more capacity to do other things. But, and this is something you and I have spoken extensively about, I mean, if strength was all that important, then the strongest athletes would also be the best endurance athletes. And we know that's not the case. We would see Olympic style lifters, which are the most powerful athletes in the world. Those people would also be the best marathoners. I mean, and we know that's not the case. And that's because they are training power exclusively. They don't need to train muscular endurance for an event like that. But so we're able to people are able to understand that these systems that we're talking about exist along a continuum, And most of the sports we're dealing with are somewhere in the middle. They last, from many minutes to many hours. That's kind of our wheelhouse that we deal with. And as a consequence, because they last so long, then the strength end of things becomes slightly less important, but the muscular endurance end of things. So we think of this marriage of the aerobic capacity and then the strength side or the power side. That is muscular endurance.
And muscular endurance is that translation of power into something meaningful for your sport, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not a translation, from all right, I'm an explosive Olympic lift athlete is not going to translate well to running. Why? Because they are too different in their mechanics. And so muscular endurance represents this kind of crossover point from which I can move over the bridge and start training the muscular system in a way that it is now applicable to the sport I'm actually after. And if we don't build that bridge through a deliberate strength path or program, we miss the ability to take that power and transition it into something meaningful in our sport. And you can see that oftentimes I'm not the strongest guy in the gym. And there are guys that, can outlift me by a lot, even on, let's say, back squat. But I can cycle with those guys and I can outcycle them because their power becomes less meaningful once we're on hour 1 or 2 of a bike ride. And now we're starting to get into this muscular endurance component where their power is no longer the differentiator of performance, but their ability to meaningfully express that power becomes the difference maker. And if we don't build that bridge in the gym, I think we miss a crucial point of strength training overall.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that is, I think, important for people. Strength training for athletes is different than strength training for aesthetics. And the methodologies involved in bodybuilding kind of captivated, I believe, and kind of took over strength training for athletes for in the past, I don't know, few decades. It used to be strength athletes would use strength training to improve their athletic performance. Bodybuilding, which is not an athletic pursuit, but an aesthetic pursuit, has an entirely different end result that it's looking for, and it's not applicable to training for athletics. I mean, you often see people who don't maybe have a physique that looks particularly strong or powerful, but they will often be the highest performing athletes. And unfortunately, I think that's gotten lost, and people have gotten confused about it. And we often hear, "Well, I don't want to go in the gym and lift weights because I'll get big." Well, no, you won't get big. If you're looking to get big, there's a way to do that, but that's not the goal of strength training for athletes. And the goal is improving your performance. And one of the issues that I have seen is that it's so easy to quantify gains in strength in a gym because all you're doing is, going to add another 2.5 pounds on this, up to this lift, and you're getting stronger. But so strength training within the four walls of the gym can take on its own life. And we as coaches and athletes should be concerned with, okay, well, how much of that increase in strength inside the gym is going to translate over to my performance outside? And this is a question that has never been answered, and I don't think it has an answer. Is how strong is strong enough? And if you're focused on what's going on inside the gym, then just getting stronger, you'd think okay, that's going to improve my performance. But we know it doesn't work that way. At some point there, you reach a point of diminishing returns. And I've spoken about this before that, okay, if you can't deadlift your body weight, then maybe you need to build your basic strength as let's say an ultra runner. But does it benefit? Is it really going to benefit you to go from like 1.5 times your body weight to 2 times your body weight in the deadlift? Are you going to see a performance improvement as a runner? It's questionable. And there have been untold numbers of studies about how much strength is enough for an athlete in their sport. And there's never been a conclusion. So I wish I had a simple answer for how, okay, what should your deadlift be if you're going to be an ultra runner? Well, I don't think I have an answer to that, but I do know that there is a point where you're probably not strong enough if you can't lift your own body weight, but you don't need to be able to deadlift 3 times your body weight to be a good ultra runner. We know that from empirical evidence. So when we talk about building strength, it's the I think the takeaway I want to have people understand is the strength training that we're talking about is not an end in itself. That's not what we're trying to do. And if it doesn't make you better, perform better, then you're wasting time and energy. And again, that's a little bit vague, I know, and I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you about how much strength training a person needs to do.
No, I mean, I think, part of the answer becomes, and this is where I take issue with any discussion surrounding strength that is like, hey, we have the answer or the complete picture, or we know definitively to do or not do, X, Y, becomes a little short-sighted. Why? Because the athlete has to drive the determination of when is enough strength enough strength. And you see that differently in different athletes. But I would say, from an athlete perspective, if you are feeling better through that strength training you are doing, if it is making you feel more resilient, or your ability to recover is improving, or your speed at your second lactic threshold or your first lactic threshold is improving, or your durability across a long workout has improved, well, then continue to chase those strength gains. But you will get to a point inherently where you feel, okay, the cost in the gym now is too high for me to train effectively, specific to my sport. Once you bridge that cost equation and now the cost is too high, you have to start focusing on what your sport actually is. And this is where, I think the deadlift is a great example of the deadlift is a massive amount of neurological fatigue on the body. If you want to train your body's ability to deadlift, you're going to be very tired the day after, especially if you're training strength. If you're training that 1 rep, 3 rep area of your capacity on deadlift, your body's going to be very tired because it requires recruitment across almost the entire body continuously. Now, if that degrades your body's ability to go out and train your aerobic capacity or train for your specific sport, then that's an issue with one caveat. Not when you first start it. When you first start it, you should expect to feel pretty tired and smoked for the first 2 weeks. And that's kind of like the break-in period of, okay, the body has to adapt to the stimulus. And it's not going to feel super comfortable for the 2 weeks, but the body learns quickly. And because it's a neurological response, the body learns very fast how to do those things. I often tell guys, there was research that made me crack up a few years ago that said, hey, if you can complete a 32-inch box jump, you have enough power to do a backflip. Well, why can't we all do backflips? Well, we can't do backflips because we haven't learned the pattern of doing a backflip. There is an element to strength training that is coordination, that is your body's ability to map something down to the muscular level from the brain. And once that is trained, then we unlock this massive capability. And that's where you see beginner gains in the gym occurs. Okay, I can get some free gains. And for a lot of ultra athletes, I think this is really what we're after is we want to unlock the body's capacity to have strength and express power without a dramatic change in our underlying weight or physiology. And all we're really doing is turning on neural pathways from the brain to the muscular system and teaching a pattern repetition, now which the body at mile 70 or 80 can recruit from because it's actually learned that pattern. If you've never learned that pattern or never expressed those muscles, you're working on a lower percentage of your overall muscle group in your body. And because of that, you will fail sooner than an athlete that has more access to a higher level of muscular productivity. But that's also where, there's a discussion of, hey, we've seen strength training in the literature improve endurance athletes. Yes. Why? Because I am learning to recruit a higher percentage of overall muscle mass. And if you take that case in extremis from an athlete that works out in the gym to one that does no strength work, of course the strength athlete's going to get better. However, if you take that strength athlete and you run the translation through to muscular endurance, Now that athlete is going to be exponentially better than both of those athletes, the athlete that did no strength training and the athlete that only did strength training. Why? Because again, I'm creating a bridge through which I can translate a usable skill into my sport itself.
One anecdote I think that resonated, or might resonate with other people, is when I was coaching skiers, and of course the U.S. ski team has their headquarters is in Park City, Utah, and they have this fabulous building, very expensive place called the Center for Excellence, and in it they have a beautiful gym. It's quite large, and it contains a bunch of what I would call strength and conditioning coaches that are coming often from, power sports. And when I had my skiers there, we'd be training, and the strength and conditioning coaches were taking these cross country skiers and trying to teach them to do Olympic lifts. And I would watch this, and I mean, their thought being, okay, we're going to make these athletes more powerful, which should be beneficial to their performance. But one of the problems with something like an Olympic lift is it's a technically very difficult movement to make. And so it requires a lot of learning time, a lot of training time. And I was pushed back pretty hard on this, saying, well, wait a minute, that's a cool party trick for these guys, but it's not going to translate into their sport because, first of all, they don't make those same kind of movements. So the Olympic lifts, while they're incredibly powerful, they're very specific to those types of movements. And when you're training power, it needs to be trained just like strength training. You need to train the muscles and the neurological system in a way that is at least semi-sport specific. You need to be using, the appropriate joint angles and the appropriate recruitment patterns. And Olympic lifts, while they're very powerful, they don't look anything like cross-country skiing. So we're going to spend hours and hours and hours in the gym making these athletes more powerful, but in a non-sport specific way. And those were hours that I could have had to train, either muscular endurance or some other components of, technical proficiency, whatever. And so that was one of the times when I began to see, okay, these guys are interested in increasing or in improving something within the four walls of the gym. But my job as the coach is to improve the performance outdoors. And if I don't see that this is going to translate well, I'm going to dig my heels in over this kind of stuff. So that's just was one of the things that I think might help people, get this idea about, I think we're going to dive into now some talks about specificity and muscle fiber recruitment patterns and things like that, that I think are helpful to understand. When I was learning all this stuff, I did some looking at recruitment patterns. I found that, we are unable, even a well-trained athlete can't recruit 100% of the muscle fibers that they've got. I mean, there's arguments about how much it is. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 60%, but it's a relatively shockingly low percentage of the muscle fibers that actually are able to be recruited in an effective way at any given time. And of course, somebody who's less well-trained may only be able to recruit 20 or 30% of those muscle fibers. So, but it's important that they're recruited in a sport-specific manner and not just in a general way. And as you were talking about, Vince, this neurologic changes in recruitment patterns, that's where we see rapid gains in strength in the gym. People will see big gains in the first, 4 to 8 weeks of strength training without any increase in muscle mass. And that's because the brain is learning how to recruit the existing muscle fibers that are there. They're just latent. They're just not being used. And I began to notice this when I was coaching these teenage girls, where you're not going to get teenage girls gaining a lot of muscle mass in general. And they just don't have the hormonal system to increase muscle mass. But what I was able to do was take these girls and develop a much higher level of strength with them, general strength. In this case, we were talking about, I wanted them to be able to do pull-ups because, skiing upper body strength is quite important. And the pull-up is like the upper body version of the deadlift in terms of, recruiting, it's a big muscle mass recruited in a pretty general way. And I was able to take these girls in a matter of 6 or 8 weeks and make huge gains in their ability to do pull-ups. In fact, in the first book I wrote, which is called Training for the New Alpinism, there's a picture of one of my skiers in my gym doing, as I think she was 16 at the time I took this picture, and she's doing pull-ups with a 35-pound weight on her waist. And that would happen over the course of a couple of months, where she went from, barely being able to do one pull-up to being able to do a pull-up with 35 pounds. And that's because the nervous system adapts really quickly to these new stimuli, which is, okay, the brain's realizing, okay, we need to recruit, the brain saying to the nervous system, we got to recruit more muscle mass to do this task. So it starts developing these pathways. And a couple of terms I want to use that I think can help people understand how this works is, so down at the muscle, at the muscle end of the nervous system is what's called the motor unit. And that is the nerve that innervates a bunch of muscle fibers. And that's a motor unit. And so the signal comes down the nervous system to the motor unit, then the signal gets dispersed among these muscle fibers that then do their thing. They retract, they contract. And when you're not very good at something, it takes a lot more energy, electrical energy or chemical energy through the nervous system to actually recruit those muscle fibers. And just like electrical wires have insulation around them, our nerves have an insulating sheath around them that's called myelin. And there's a process called myelination that if you repeatedly send this signal down that nerve, the myelin gets thicker. So there's less loss, just like better insulation on the wires going down there. And as we're learning technical skills, and that could be, a pull-up, or it could be playing the piano, one of the things that's happening is those nerves that are that the signal is going down to those motor units that are being used repeatedly, thousands and thousands of repetitions, they develop more myelin on them. And so the recruitment pattern becomes more efficient. The brain doesn't need the motor cortex in the brain doesn't need to send as strong a signal. And so when you're first learning something, it takes a lot of concentration because there is this loss and I'm speaking in not very specific, let's say biomechanical or biochemical terms here, but I think people can get the picture of what's happening. And so myelination plays a huge role in the ability to perform strength or powerful movements. But if we myelinate the wrong motor units and nerves, it's really not going to. That's why, okay, these Olympic lifts are really amazing things to be able to do. But those aren't the same nerve patterns and recruitment patterns that my skiers are going to need when they're skiing. So, anyway, that's another one of those terms I think it's important for people to at least have a grasp of how this whole recruitment thing works.
Yeah, and there's an ancillary discussion there of if the brain is the driver of performance, and we're talking about performance over, an ultra distance or trails or long duration skis or mountaineering, all athletes have felt that sensation of brain fog over time, or that ability for like the brain, you make worse cognitive decisions the longer you are doing something. That is just given. Why? Because the brain is fatiguing as well. And in a day and age where we talk about carbohydrate use all the time, it is important to note that the brain runs almost exclusively off carbohydrates. So even if you're not using a lot of carbs from a sense of your muscular system, or you're still largely burning fat for performance throughout these durations, your brain is on overdrive, shooting these thousands of repetitions and patterns constantly using primarily carbohydrates. So as the brain starts degrading its ability to send those signals, you start getting that brain fog. You start getting that almost innate confusion. But if the muscle isn't well trained to almost become a subconscious recruitment pattern, it will fail. And you see that in
Yeah.
guys that can't pick their feet up off the trail and start tripping late in a race, right? Or You can no longer push your ski out as far as you had before because you're losing the perfect repetition that you've practiced over and over and over again at a subconscious level because those neurons are no longer even making it because the loss is so great or because the energy system feeding the brain has been depleted so much. And
Yeah.
so I think, as an athlete, when you're out there and you're starting to feel that brain fog activity, understand that that is having a muscular effect on you as well.
Yeah.
Because if you can't think well, it's already an indicator that you are not delivering the neurological messages as well either to the muscular system.
Yeah, and that's where, as we become more proficient at an activity and that myelination improves, it takes less to fire those motor units. And that's where the whole concept of sports specificity is, that's what it's doing. I mean, we know that it's better to train, specifically for your sport than generally for a sport. I mean, swimming is a great exercise, but it is not going to make you a faster runner. That's, I think a perfect example of this, sports specificity. But I also know, and we're going to talk about this, I think, in a bit, that you can overdo specificity. You can overuse the concept of sports specificity. And I think that's one of the areas that where there exists confusion about the role of strength training or power training or muscular endurance training is, well, wait a minute, if I'm training for this activity, why don't I just do that activity all the time? Whether it's running or cycling or hiking or whatever it is, I'm just going to do that one thing because that's what my event looks like. Why don't I just train for this one event? Or this why don't I train for my event and with this one modality? Then I can maximize the amount of time. The problem is that we know that supplemental or non-sport specific training um, can help bolster this system. Like, laying, as Vince talked about in the very beginning, laying a strength foundation and laying a power foundation will translate into better performance. And again, not from, we know that from science, but we also know it anecdotally that you need some general non-sport specific training in your repertoire to maximize your performance. Um,
Yeah. I think that is where some of this conversation gets lost. Muscular endurance is not the end state goal of the training. The end state goal of the training is specificity. And a great example of this, in the outcome of UTMB, and the hidden nugget of weighted pack work that came out. Weighted pack work was not something added to the front end of a program to make an athlete successful. Weighted pack work became the expression of moving along this pipeline of strength to power, power to muscular endurance to specificity, because now an athlete has the chance to complete a workout in which they are going to aerobically and muscularly develop at the same time. Now we can merge these two competing pathways together because we've trained them first discrete before we've brought them together. I think a big, thing I saw in the aftermath of UTMB was guys right away were like, let's get into weighted pack work, and let's start doing some threshold work with a pack. Well, that is not the buy-in is not pack work. You earn the right to do specificity in your training over time, and you earn it by marching down this pathway where eventually you can express that level of specificity actually doing something close to your event rather than just adding it in right away and expecting good things to happen. I will tell you right now, if you put on a pack today and you try to do some sort of second lactic threshold workout, muscularly, you will fail before your heart ever gets there. You will be unable to do it. Not because you're unable to do it, in a macro sense, but because you haven't trained down the steps to get there. And, I think a phenomenal example of this right now is in training, like we see elite athletes doing with some of the weighted work people are starting to do again, whether that's weighted pack work or eccentric weighted work. But what we're seeing is that is not something that we just started doing with athletes recently. That is 4 or 5 years of progression to get to that level of specificity in order to drive a reaction or return we want. And muscular endurance work has to be present there before you can expect to do that level of work that is highly specific in nature. If not, you will just fail or something will break, or the tissue, the underlying tissue that supports it, whether that's bone, tendon, or the muscular system, will fracture and break on you. Why? Because those things progress at a much slower rate than the aerobic system does. The aerobic system, your heart, your metabolic system, all adapts very quickly. These underlying tissues like bone take years to adapt to this strenuous stimulus. And then once they adapt, now you can be a very, very dangerous weapon in terms of training of what you're able to handle and maintain over time.
Well, and this, takes you back to that one of those statements I made, or one of those observations I mentioned early in our conversation today, is I was noticing my young skiers fatiguing during sport-specific training. There's nothing more. I mean, the reason people do interval style high intensity training is for its specificity. It looks like the most taxing, demanding part of some kind of endurance competition. In this case, skiing uphill hard, that's the most demanding part of the ski race. So why don't we train you to do this repeatedly over and over? We're going to ski up this hill for 3 minutes and turn around, come back down, do that a bunch of times. But I was noticing they were fatiguing. And the reason they were fatiguing was the lack of muscular endurance. So when I laid a foundation of muscular endurance before we went to this sport specific type training, we got better results in the sport specific training. And that's what you just were mentioning there, that yes, the weighted pack carries and other types of muscular endurance. And there are many different ways to create a muscular endurance effect. But those things that have been all over the internet ever since Tom and Ruth won UTMB, and lots of people have been jumping on that bandwagon, and there are also people who've been critical of that bandwagon. But they're not looking at what it took to get Tom and Ruth to that place, and then also not looking at why we're doing that weighted pack carrying stuff and how it's the foundation for the next step, which is sport specificity. Because their event isn't carrying 10 or 15 kilos up a hill. That's not their event. So we're using this as a step between. I mean, this is a little bit of a oversimplification, but we're using this weighted pack carry as a step between the gym and the race and the sport and the specific training, let's say the standard, more typical uphill interval training. It's a bridge between those two, as you've said.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to remember, that there is absolutely an argument to be had of, if volume is king, then it is more beneficial to just run more, rather than do this other peripheral work. However, the counter argument there that I would like to propose is, if we think of a week in terms of training stress, and its relationship, as you've discussed many times, Scott, that relationship between weekly training stress and your event stress that you are targeting. It is very hard to get a level of systemic stress in the body equal to that of your final goal. If it's a 100-mile race, I mean, that stress could be enormous. It could be through the roof, that amount of stress you're going to experience. In order to accumulate that much stress in a week where you're getting recovery cycles, your volume would have to be enormous to get that level of return. Instead, we know through years of application that we use intensity as a substitute to get to that level of chronic stress that we're trying to obtain, to adapt the body that direction. Well, one way we can drive that adaptive stress is to stress the body under more force and impact, or speed, in order to get some of that increased fatigue. This is why we still train at the second lactic threshold, even when we're preparing for an ultra marathon. Why? Because we are getting a larger stress response for the body through which it can adapt to this mega stress that it's going to experience on a single day. Muscular endurance works similarly, because we're targeting these muscle fibers that otherwise we wouldn't get to target if we just continue to run slow on the trail for an additional 15, 20 minutes. And we also see this in cycling literature and studies, where at the end of workouts, guys are doing repetitions of 10 by 20 seconds of, a higher velocity work coming out of it, or, stride work, or hill sprint work, or muscular endurance work. All of these things are representations of the same thing that I think we should dive into now. And that's, what muscle fiber differentiations are we targeting in this work? And why does that discussion matter when we talk about muscular endurance training as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's a great time to transition into the talk about muscle fibers and muscle fiber types. I mean, many people have heard the term slow twitch or type 1 or fast twitch or type 2 fibers. And there's been a simplified, and these fibers exist along a spectrum. And from the slowest slow twitch, which might be, moving your little finger, to the most powerful fast twitch, which might be used in your quadriceps, your glutes, and your calves to do a vertical leap, an explosive movement like that. But and we often, these have been, I think, unfortunately, categorized as distinct fiber types. That, okay, there's a fast twitch A and a fast twitch B, or a type 2B and type 2A, those sorts of things, and type 2X. But in fact, more recent literature shows that this is a continuum, that these fibers exist not in. So there's going to be slower, there's going to be the slowest slow twitch, and then there's going to be some slow twitch fibers that would be categorized as slow twitch that are much more powerful than the slowest slow twitch fibers. And the differentiation between these fiber types is their size, their cross-sectional area, the size of the neuron that drives them, the motor unit, and also the amount of mitochondria that they contain. And that's one of the things I think that we will want to really speak about here as we get into the rabbit hole of fiber types and their recruitment patterns, is that the people who are familiar with a little bit of physiology, and certainly the stuff that we've talked about for years, is that we know that mitochondria is the aerobic engine of energy production in the muscle. And the more mitochondria a muscle fiber has, the more endurance it's going to be endowed with. And the slowest slow twitch fibers, like the ones that I'm using in my jaw right now, very rarely become fatigued because they're so highly aerobically adapted. Similarly, our heart muscle, the reason your heart doesn't get tired when you're running is that it's the most aerobically adapted slow twitch fibers in the body are in the heart. The most highest density of mitochondria are in the heart. And through training, we can improve, as people know, we can improve the aerobic capacity, our let's say in our overall in general aerobic capacity. But when we do that, what we're actually doing is increasing the mitochondrial content of the muscle fibers that we're recruiting to do this work. And as we move up the scale of force production from slowest slow twitch to fastest fast twitch, we start to see fibers that have lower and lower mitochondrial density in them. So these are fibers that can produce a lot of force, but they can't repeat that force production for very, very many contractions before they become fatigued. And then they've got to go sit on the bench and rest before they can be recruited again. And at some point, and I've used this kind of analogy. I hope it's useful for people. I've used it in the past trying to explain this. So I'm going to use a really simple, an oversimplification, but I think it'll help people frame a picture of this in their mind. So you're going to have the brain gets, as we talked about before, gets really good at recruiting certain muscle fibers. And so when you're running at a relatively slow pace, a 10-minute mile, let's say, it's going to recruit this same pool of motor units and muscle fibers repeatedly, thousands and thousands of repetitions. And during that, because of that, those fibers become more aerobically adapted. But as we move up the speed scale, so now we want to go from running at a 10-minute mile pace to an 8-minute mile pace. The brain has to recruit faster, stronger fibers. They're going to go up the fast twitch fiber scale here. The brain's got to recruit more powerful fibers. Well, we've just said that those more powerful fibers also have fewer mitochondria. They have less, they're not as vascularized, they're not vascularized as well, so they don't get as much oxygen. And as a consequence, they're going to have less endurance, which is the reason you can run longer at a 10-minute mile pace than you can at an 8-minute mile pace. And as we continue up that scale, you're going to, there's going to be a limit to the endurance. And those fibers that the brain needs to recruit to now run at a 6-minute mile pace, those fibers even have a worse, a lower endurance capability. And so if we take an event it's a 100-mile race, or let's just say a long distance race, because I want to keep this very simplified. You're going to run this event is going to be run at a 10-minute mile pace. So you're going to need to train a lot around a 10-minute mile pace, because those are the fibers you're going to be using. And as the cool part about these fibers is the slower the slow twitch, the more asynchronous recruitment is possible. I'll explain what that means. So you've got a huge pool of recruitable fibers that the brain can choose from. When they're slow twitch fibers, it can go in and select fibers that as one of the slow twitch fibers becomes fatigued, it just goes over here and grabs another slow twitch fiber next to it and starts recruiting it. When we have a huge pool of recruitable fibers, the brain can be selectively recruiting among those. As we move up the scale of force production in the faster twitch fibers, we lose that asynchronous recruitment capability. Fibers are recruited more synchronously. In other words, to do a vertical leap, your brain is recruiting these fast twitch fibers, and it has to recruit all of them at once. And it can't recruit them asynchronously. It can't let those fibers rest. I mean, you can't set some of them aside to rest while others are doing the work, because they're all connected. The motor neuron that drives them is a big motor unit, and it has to recruit all these fibers at once. So what we would like to do to improve the performance of any athlete is at the event specific speed that they need to be maintaining. And it's easier to think about this in, let's say, a flat running race where the speed is going to be pretty consistent, as compared to a mountainous race where the speed is going to go from walking uphill to running fast on the flats. But just think about this to make our model simpler to digest and understand. As we get to a speed that is at what I call the frontier of your endurance, you are now recruiting the fibers that have just enough endurance to sustain that speed for the duration that's required. And that's going to be, so in a 5-kilometer race, those are going to be some faster twitch fibers than in a 10-kilometer race or in a marathon. As we move up, that scale, those fibers have less endurance. But what we know now, I think certainly this is the theory I have used with as my understanding of muscular endurance training is, the reason I think it's so effective is we're adding resistance to the movement, and that could be through a number of different ways. But let's say the uphill weighted pack carry that allows us to target those fibers that are at that frontier of endurance and keep them under load for a long duration. And then by keeping them under load for a long duration, they become more aerobically adapted. They will develop more mitochondria. So, you can gain muscular endurance by doing high intensity interval training. I'm honestly of the belief that that's the primary benefit of high intensity interval style training, is that you're recruiting these fastest twitch fibers that are needed to maintain the pace of the event that you're training for. You're repeatedly doing sustained work with them so that they become more aerobically adapted. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, there is obviously some central adaptations to the heart, but my belief is that the primary benefit of, let's say, a standard interval workout is increasing muscular endurance. But the problem with those standard interval workouts is, as we've said before, if you don't have good muscular endurance, you're not going to be able to maintain that power for very long. And secondly, the global fatigue load of conventional interval style training is tremendous in terms of the overall fatigue on the body. What we have found with this muscular endurance type training, where we are isolating just those fibers at that limit. Those are our primary limit. And we can improve their muscular endurance with this targeted, like, we're targeting these frontier fibers almost exclusively, and we can do it without the global stress because the fibers themselves become the limit, not the cardiovascular system. Whereas when we're doing conventional interval training, we have a big cardiovascular load as well as a big muscular load. But in muscular endurance training in general, the cardiovascular load is low, but the muscle load is high. I hope I haven't lost people and confused them with that.
No, no. I think my big takeaway from all that, and it's consistent across all systems. If we go aerobic to anaerobic, it exists on a dimmer switch. If we go from strength to muscular endurance, it goes on a dimmer switch. When we talk about fiber types and expression, again, we're talking about a dimmer switch. None of the systems in the body are a light switch that I flip on and off. And I think
Yeah.
too often we want to treat them that way of, oh, I'm not going to train a certain thing because I'm not ever flipping that switch. If you have ever done a long duration race before or activity before, I want you to think about real quick the athletic movements you've done out there that you didn't plan for. That could be jumping up and over a ledge. That could be, you take a giant leap across a rooted spot to get a safe position for your foot. That could be while you're running downhill, especially, and we're under eccentric load, which is going to recruit more of these fiber types in order to handle the absolute load or the force you're applying. That is a very athletic movement as you're trying to catch yourself and move. Those fiber types exist higher in that domain that you were talking about, Scott, up in those type 2 fibers. And you don't even realize you're necessarily using them until it's too late. A great rule of thumb I like to give guys in like these long distance events is like there should be no athletic movements for the first like 50, 60 miles. Why? Because they will come back to bite you. Why? Because as I fatigue these higher end fibers down the line, they need longer and longer rest time in order to come back online. Well, eventually I keep recruiting from closer and closer to that limit that we're talking about. And now I can't recruit any of that muscular system up here. And that's when we talk about like, now there's a very high RPE with a low heart rate because all these muscles on the right side of the continuum have turned off and my ability to recruit them is gone. And so now I'm trying to do some level of movement on less percentage of my muscular system. Therefore, if I neglect the training of those muscular systems that are across the spectrum, I am literally just taking a tool out of my toolbox and leaving it at home. That's why
Yeah.
the discussion of like, hey, we should just train strength and then run makes, that's such a dichotomous view of training principles when if every system we have in our body exists along a dimmer switch, then in order to maximize our system, we have to train along the entire dimmer switch. We have to train all these individual little pieces of the pie slowly over time in order for the body to be able to express them, to recruit them, and then to use them efficiently in practice. And that's where I think the discussion of, hey, let's only focus on one style of strength training, or let's not focus on this style of strength training, or let's not focus on this style of repetitions or this high velocity work. All of those things miss the mark of, I think Renata Canova had a great point when he says, hey, when I bring on a new athlete, I change nothing. I just see what they're missing and I added it. Because what essentially he's saying is like all of us as coaches have these biases inherent to us and we miss something. We miss a piece of this dimmer switch. And once you plug it in, you fill a gap and a hole. And now the expression of overall like fitness and performance can increase over time. But you've got to fill these holes across the entire spectrum or you're leaving performance at home. I think is my big takeaway from all of that, Scott.
So I like the idea of, training along, as you say, a dimmer switch. I like the idea of a continuum, but yeah, same idea. And we need to train all along that continuum or all that entire dimmer switch has to be trained. And what we, as you said, Canova was looking for, what's missing from this athlete's training. And I call it the low hanging fruit. Like, okay, when athletes come to me, I want to try to figure out what is it that's missing from their training that will increase their performance. Where and because things that you're really good at, it's very hard to improve things that you're already good at. Whereas if we find things that you kind of suck at, then it's pretty easy to make improvements there. So I'm looking for that low-hanging fruit all the time with my athletes. And consistently over the past 30 years, one of the low-hanging fruit things I have seen is they lack muscular endurance. And they lack often aerobic capacity. So there's two areas that we know are critical to overall endurance performance that if you're lacking in those, one of those or both of them, then those are the areas we can target. And as one of the things you said earlier is this, which I think is, I want to revisit for just a second, is this idea that, well, why don't we just run more? Why don't we just, run longer at this, let's say you're out for an hour run. Well, let's just outrun an hour and 15 minutes. Isn't that going to improve muscular endurance? Probably will to some extent, because it exists somewhere along this continuum. But if you're running at the same pace, you're not going to be recruiting these limiting fibers. You're not operating up close to this what I would call these frontier fibers that are at the frontier of your endurance. And the beauty of muscular endurance training is it's specifically targeting those fibers at that. And those fibers, because they have relatively poor endurance, they don't need a super long duration of training. In fact, if you do a long duration of training with them, you're not recruiting them anymore. You're having to recruit fibers that are lower force but have better endurance. And which is again why kids were slowing down in the interval workout, because those fibers that were at the fibers that were allowing them to, let's say, run at a 6-minute mile pace became fatigued after the first repetition. So the next repetition had to recruit a set of the fibers that it could recruit that had more endurance that only allowed these athletes to run at a 6:30 pace for that next repetition. And then the next repetition, they had to slow down to a 7-minute mile pace because as these frontier fibers became fatigued, the brain could only recruit, lower force but higher endurance fibers that would allow them to run longer but at a slower pace. And I think the couple of things that are overlooked about this muscular endurance training is, first of all, it's not necessarily replacing a lot of volume. I mean, these athletes are still, that my runners like Tom and Ruth, they're still running a lot. And they're only doing this type of muscular, it's very specific training. It might be, one day a week, one workout a week of this type of training. So it's not like we're completely replacing running with muscular endurance training, weighted uphill hiking. That would be, I think, a mistake. But I think that might be one of the misconceptions about this is it somehow, replacing the volume of training.
No, I think it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox, and the more tools you can use over time in a simple manner, the more bulletproof the body gets overall. And the more you defend from different positions, the effects that can happen on the body over a long duration, a myriad of variables come into play. And you're talking about more variables than we can plan for or anticipate in a training cycle or train up. But the more we can defend against those variables from coming in and affecting our performance, the more likely we are to have a positive performance or a good outcome in a race. Setting aside one of those defense mechanisms and saying, like, well, we just won't use that one, creates a hole through which maybe it affects you on the day, maybe it doesn't. But if it does, you're going to really regret for the remaining duration you're on the trail neglecting that portion of training. And that's where I think to come back to this, the power of training is this full spectrum that we're trying to hit. I mean, it's why coaches use strides at the end of a run, right? Are they actually producing like a large effect? No, but consistently over time, are they producing a positive adaptation? Absolutely. They're training you to run with great form while slightly fatigued. If you don't do that, then you can't expect to run with great form while fatigued. And so you're going to degrade out on an event. If we don't practice these things that can occur, then we're kind of training in a manner that says like I anticipate my race day is going to go perfectly anyway. Which is a wildly arrogant way to train, to say like I am training so well with just running that I need not touch anything else, or I need not do anything else. And so I think applying more tools and more protection is always beneficial. And I think that kind of brings us to like what are those tools, and use cases that we can use to actually plug into this methodology and say like, okay, here are some application techniques that we utilize in order to kind of model some of this, again, with the caveat of like, this is not the end all be all. This is not the destination, nor is it the start point. Muscular endurance happens somewhere within a coherent strength plan. And so we're really only talking about a portion of the pie today, not hey, let's do 52 weeks of muscular endurance training,
Four
and
days a
let's start
week.
today,
Yeah.
4 days a week, and start today. That is not
Yeah.
the discussion here. So we're talking about a specific tool that we like to add in as a defense mechanism from muscular failure.
And I think it's important to, because this type of training, because and I my theoretical approach to this, my understanding, or the little model I built in my brain to help me grasp this idea is, because we're targeting these fibers that are what I'm calling them, they're at the frontier of your endurance, and they have relatively limited endurance capacity. The training stimulus does not need to be that frequent, and there can't be that much duration of it, because these fibers take a long time to recover. So but it's a very powerful training effect that I've seen. And anybody who has played around with muscular endurance training, I know many, many thousands of people have now since I started writing about it. Um, and I didn't, again, I'm not claiming that I invented any of this. I might be one of the more active um, uh, kind of pontificators about it now, but it's certainly an old concept. I mean, the very first time I read about this was in a book written by Tudor Bompa, who is I think some Eastern Bloc, Soviet system coach, and he wrote a book called the theory and the training and the theory and methodology of training. And in it, he discusses, this is written back in the 50s, and talking about he uses the term muscular endurance. So this is an old concept. I didn't invent it. I'm just trying to figure out how to apply it to these sports. But um, the it has a very powerful training effect. And anybody who's played with it will tell you that. If you do it correctly, you will see significant gains in performance. I can guarantee it. I've never known a person who used this effectively, and I'll talk about what that means, who didn't see dramatic increases in fatigue. Let's call it fatigue resistance. I believe that's its end goal, is to make you more fatigue resistant. Um, and what I mean by using it effectively is not overusing it. Because it has such a strong effect, you can't subject yourself to it very much. And so I often tell people 1 session a week is all you need with this stuff. Even a very high level athlete, 1 time a week will be plenty. And if you do not see consistent improvement from week to week, by the metrics we could talk about how we're going to measure improvement, then it's not that the training's not working. It's that you're not recovering between these sessions. And so I think it's very important to understand that because it's such a powerful training stimulus, it needs a lot of recovery, which is one of the reasons we tend to stress it more in the, kind of a certain period of the training. We don't do this, typically all year long. I mean, I've known people that have extended it for many, many weeks. I've never used a muscular endurance block that was longer than about 16 weeks. That's I think the maximum I've ever done. I've seen, I think you need to have at least 6 to 8 weeks to really begin to see the benefits of of what it can do for you. Um, but it's not a steady diet of this. And again, like I said, we're not changing it so these people are not running. They're still running with their training. So, but maybe we should talk a little bit about some of these methods that we use, or do you have, am I am I jumping too far ahead in our little outline here, Vince?
No, I think, yeah, I think it makes cogent sense to go into some of the methods.
So the practicality of this, like, well, how do you do it? And I've said this many times. There's a any way you can increase the the requirement, the recruitment of the muscle mass to target those fibers that are at this limit, and how we determine what that limit is, we'll speak to in a minute, is going to work. So, let's say it's putting a pack on your back and running or hiking uphill. That's obvious. So that's going to have this effect. Seated cycling. That is, I mean, I think one of the beauties of it, I'm not saying that's necessarily specific to a runner, but you can definitely increase the muscular loading because you have a derailleur that allows you to change, find the gear that's going to target those muscles, fibers in the legs. We can use these circuit style gym exercises, which is one of the first places I saw it used with running was in Peter Coe's book on how he trained his son Sebastian Coe. They talked about doing circuit style training in the gym where, or maybe even outdoors, where they would have partners and they would do things like one partner would get on the other guy's back and they would do squat jumps with that. And then they would rotate through a circuit of similar type of weighted exercises. And so any of these methodologies can work. It's not rocket science. You're trying to, and the way you'll know when it's working for you is the fatigue will be in the muscle. The limitation to your ability to perform these exercises will be, and if it's a long sustained exercise like hiking uphill with a pack, you're going to feel a low grade burn in the muscle. And that's when you know you've targeted those fibers that are at the limit or your limit of endurance.
Yeah.
Um, but my go-tos, I mean, we have an article on the website if anybody would like to go read about this. It's called Muscular Endurance, Everything You Need to Know. And in it, I outline, these two predominant methods that I think we've kind of settled on. One is the uphill weighted carries, and the other is a gym circuit style work. Both of which have proven to be very, very effective. And we don't probably, it would be hard to describe the circuit here, but people can read about it. And there's I don't think it's a PDF you can download, but there is a description of the actual workout and a progression over, I think, 12 weeks of what that would look like in that article.
Yeah, and a few disclaimers as you started. First, you should expect to feel wildly sore the first, second day after. And so because it's a new stimulus to the body, you are recruiting a new series of pathways. And as we're talking about, those muscles are just waking up. When muscle wakes up for the first time, it is not the most pleasant experience, which is even why, taking the recommendations that we have on where to start and even dialing it back is okay. If you can do it 1 week and wake up the next day feeling great, then just add a little bit to that the next week. And when we talk about adding to it in a controlled manner and wanting to see progression, I think of all training in four variables, and those variables are duration, repetition, intensity, and recovery. And week to week, we only really need to change one of those variables. If you change two variables in any equation and you only got one equation, good luck ever solving it, right? You'll never know what went wrong or what the mechanism was that caused the failure. But if you just do a muscular endurance workout and the next week you mess with the amount of rest or the amount of repetition or the amount of intensity, maybe you're doing it weighted versus unweighted, or the duration that it is. So the amount of sets you're actually doing of a workout, then what went wrong the next week if something goes terribly wrong. And an extremist example of this is like if I started with 3x10 on 60-second recovery of back squat jumps, and then the next week I went to 3x100. at 60-second recovery, we would know what the issue was, right? We jumped too much from 10 to 100 reps in a row. Uh, and you can also see that in like a more subtle sense of like maybe I go to 3 by 15 and that was too much. That even that jump was too much. Or I'm starting with 90 seconds of recovery and I'm coming down to 75 seconds recovery, and that cut of recovery didn't allow me now to get through a full set and session of this. So I think as you're approaching this and you're thinking about it, only manipulating one of those variables per week allows you to, as Scott was talking about, monitor your progression through it and make sure I am recovering enough in order to reattack this workout the next week. Because if you fail to get through it, then we know you haven't. And something's got to shift around. The other thing is when we talk about protecting quality work, you don't want to do ME the day before you're trying to do quality work. And quality work will define as, I'm doing work right at my first or second lactic threshold. It's something very specific to the driver I'm driving. Typically, I avoid doing ME right before those. Why? Because you will have this kind of universal fatigue that will degrade your ability to put in high quality work for your specific session that you're going towards. And then, two more caveats I have is muscular endurance work isn't cardio. Too often in the gym, we conflate like gym work with cardio work. And I think this is probably a crossover issue that came from CrossFit of like strength work is cardio work, power work is cardio work. These circuit style works are cardio work. The focus here is on the muscular system. So if you're doing this work and your limiting factor is your aerobic system, meaning you're bent over on your hands and knees trying to catch your breath, we are failing at the workout's goal. The goal is the muscular contraction and ability to repeatedly attack that muscle. The limiter should not be the aerobic system in this style of work. So if you find that it is, then a couple of those variables to look at is how much rest am I taking between sets? How long are my sets? If they become too long, now I start becoming this, I have this cardiovascular effect, and actually my muscular recruitment is going to drop to try and compensate for that. So don't treat your strength work as cardio work. Treat it like you're targeting the muscle deliberately. And then yes, there's for sure an argument of, hey, you'll never do a jumping lunge out on the trail. Sure, yes, you will never, hopefully in the middle of your race, never have to do a jumping lunge. However, by doing the jumping lunge, I am attacking not only muscles I will use further along my dimmer switch, I'm also targeting stabilization muscles that I'm less likely to target, but more likely that will fatigue. Great examples of this is your hip flexors, your posterior chain, the outside of your hips. These things fatigue on athletes all the time. And when they do, they become large limiters to performance. But they are not things that normally get taxed or stimulated enough in just easy duration running to see progression. And as Scott was mentioning earlier, only the things we target specifically and hit specifically develop, whether that's through mitochondrial biogenesis or capillarization. If I'm not hitting it, it is not receiving positive adaptation, which again means that I've got a chink in my armor or a gap in my defense for when I want to go to perform. So a few things to think about as you're implementing those. And then, yeah, we've got the articles on the website that really lay out a bunch of the different functional reps and sets and workouts we can use. But also know you can pair this specific to whatever your goal is. And while a lot of our modalities focus on the lower body, you can absolutely translate these into upper body modalities, which we've done with, guys that have to do a lot of pole work on the mountains, getting into a lat pull down style instead of a jumping back squat style. These things translate. Again, we're not trying to recreate the wheel. We're taking this applied methodology, from the Eastern Bloc or from the Kenyan athletes that are seeing success, and then saying like, well, if it works on your quad, it probably also works on your bicep because those muscles are largely the same or composed of the same material, and the stimulus should work similarly across the body. So as a whole, I would say you can apply this across a larger set of performance and think about this really as an additive, but again, not, as Scott was saying earlier, a substitute for volume. It is something we add on and become something that helps us defend against degradation of performance.
Yeah, that idea of being able to use it for the upper body. So, you know, as I mentioned in the very beginning, muscular endurance training has been a part of swim training for forever, I think. As a kid, we used to swim with, when you put a pull buoy between your legs, that is adding a great deal of resistance. So yes, yeah, it takes your legs out of the equation. So people think of it, oh, it's just so that you're not kicking, you're just using your arms, but it's also creating drag. So you're having to pull harder with it. Um, some other water sports like rowing and paddling sports where they will put drags on the bottoms of the boats in order to increase the resistance so it can train muscular endurance. Um, there's people are probably familiar with the device called a ski erg. Now it's become quite popular it's obviously used by cross-country skiers, but I use it with a lot of my runners for training upper body. Well, there was a device like that. One of the first ones I ever saw was actually for paddlers, kayakers, where the two ropes were attached to the end of a bar that looked like the paddle, and the rower was sitting in front of this device that looked like a ski erg and paddling with it to create, and so it's creating resistance. So these paddlers were using, I think it was in Scandinavia somewhere where I saw this. Where the paddlers are increasing, they're training muscular endurance with this stuff. So these ideas of isolating these muscle fibers and adding extra resistance to those muscle fibers are applicable across a lot of different sports and certainly have been in use for a long time. The This idea of, well, let's talk about the feelings, because heart rate is not going to be a great metric. So I often tell people, forget your zones when they're doing this kind of training. It's not important. That's not what we're after. As you said, Vince, we're not really trying to think of this as aerobic training or cardiovascular training. We're trying to target this as muscular training in a way. So it's again on that. This is at the junction of the aerobic and metabolic system and the neurologic strength system. We're talking about this junction of where these things come together, which is the essence of sport. We're never going to be all at one in our endurance sports. We're never going to be operating at such a low intensity that we're way out on the aerobic spectrum metabolically, and we're never going to be operating at such a high force and powers end of the spectrum, that we're way out there on the neurologic side. We're somewhere in the middle, and that's why we're doing this type of training. But I'm going to give a couple of, from my experience, and you've worked with this a lot too, Vince, so you can give me some of your thoughts on it. But what I tell people is you want to have this, the feeling is the limitation is in the muscles, not cardiovascularly. So, and if you are, as you mentioned, if you are getting a huge cardiovascular effect from this type of training, you probably are aerobically deficient and need more work aerobically before you even start to work on this kind of stuff, because that's your low-hanging fruit at the moment. Well, both of these things could be your low-hanging fruit, but the aerobic system is what's going to support this work. It's going to be what allows you to do a high volume of muscular endurance. It's going to be it's going to be what allows you to recover between the sets or repetitions. It's going to be allows you improve your ability to recover between workouts, day to day. So that's why the aerobic base that we talk about is so critical to every endurance, and it's really the priority, every endurance activity. But you're looking for what I think of as kind of a low grade burn through these workouts that is not going to be reflected in your heart rate. Yes, you may have a high heart rate. I don't really care what your heart rate is. You don't even need to wear a heart rate monitor when you're doing this training. Try to target those muscle fibers. And then the other thing I mentioned that I believe is important is that you see improvement. And the improvement will come if you recover enough between these sessions. And it's important to keep the aerobic volume fairly high during a muscular endurance training block. That's why I said we're not, just substitute this in lieu of aerobic work. So keep the aerobic volume at high. You may need to reduce some of the intensity of some of those aerobic sessions so you are adequately recovered. But this, when you read this article on the website, you'll see these two kind of progressions I talk about. But the one that's a gym-based circuit style, it progresses from week to week. And as Vince was saying, it really only is going to change one variable each week. Typically, it'll be in the beginning of that progression will increase the number of sets you'll be doing. So we increase the volume of the work. Then we might later, if you're seeing sufficient improvement, we might add resistance. Like maybe it's a weight vest you put on. But that would be the only variable that changes at that point. And then as the thing progresses, the next thing we reduce is the rest between sets. And that's when you really begin to see the endurance end of the endurance of muscular endurance comes into play. We might start with, as Vince said, it could be 90 or 60-second recovery between sets. But by the end of this progression, you're going to be resting 10 seconds between sets. Then by that time, you will begin to realize, oh, I can tell now, I can see how this improves endurance because I'm getting less recovery. I'm densifying the workload. I'm doing more work in a shorter period of time. So that progression will take you through. Again, if you're resting appropriately, you will see this progression. You'll end up at the end of this 12 weeks with 10 seconds rest. The other thing I noticed in these weighted uphill carries, when I first started doing them, as I mentioned, I was preparing to go climb K2, and I had this, like it was a 1,700-foot, very steep hill, and I was carrying water weight up the hill, dumping it at the top, running down, filling it up in a creek, going back up. And I noticed each week I did this, and I was only able to do it one day a week. My time was improving dramatically. You can do this if you had a longer hill. In my case, I was going all the way to the top, but if you have a longer hill, what I've done in the past is on other hills is I'll build a little cairn. I'm typically hiking on steep terrain here. So that means straight up the fall line. A normal trail is not going to give you a very big muscular endurance stimulus, because typical trails are going to be in the range of 8 to 12% gradient. And you may get a little bit of a muscular effect from that muscular endurance effect, but where you really begin to see it is when the gradient gets to 20 to 30%. And not very many trails are built to that gradient. So you may have to go off trail to do that. But what I've done is, hike up the hill for 45 minutes with this pack on, build a little cairn, come back a week later, and I notice now when I pass that cairn at 38 minutes instead of 45 minutes. So already in just a week I'm seeing significant improvements. And so I'll build a little cairn at the top of my new 45-minute mark. And each week I keep passing these cairns at faster. I'm going up the hill faster. So those are ways to kind of gauge the improvement. And I think that people often ask me, okay, if I'm carrying this weight up the hill, should I carry it back down? And I would say reservedly, yes. But you need to have strong legs to be able to carry weight downhill because of the eccentric loading. So even with some of my top athletes, I don't suggest that they run downhill with a pack. Not so much, I'm a little less worried about them muscularly than them twisting an ankle. On a rough trail. So be a little careful if you're going to try to carry the weight back down the hill. Now, if you're a mountaineer, I think you should be carrying your weight back down the hill, because you're going to have to do that in the mountains. Or if you're a tactical athlete, I think carrying weight uphill and downhill is really important. But if you're training for something like mountain running, carry the weight up the hill, dump the water at the top, and then just run down fast. You'll be able to run down. Then you're also training agility and quickness and hand-eye or foot-eye coordination, rather than walking down slowly with a heavier pack. So I think it's a little more sport specific to do it that way.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not airing Tom's business out here, but he did post it on his social media, so I'll bring it up because it kind of gets to this point. Because recently Tom Evans posted on his social media a workout where he flipped the direction of his woodway, and he's running downhill. He has ankle weights and a weight vest on. Now, if you are new to sport and you saw that, you'd be like, "That is a recipe for disaster. That guy's going to get hurt in a week." But Tom has been along this progression, for four years now of implementing muscular endurance, seeing it in a more specific manner, and then applying it to the trail. And he's gone through these iterations. So, like you're saying, now he's finally to the point where he's doing this weighted downhill work that I think is, relatively newer to him. When we spoke, 2 years ago about Tom's training, it was we're filling up the water, we're going up, we're dumping it out. He's running down, and now he's starting to progress. But you're talking about progression over the scope of years, right? And
Yeah.
and saying like, okay, we've gone through a entire training cycle, we found success. Now let's go back to that mentality of what's missing or what can
Yeah.
we add,
What can we
right?
add? Yep,
We're not
absolutely.
changing any of the structure around the rest of the stuff. Largely, he's doing the same training, but we're just now saying, okay, well, we know we're getting this positive stimulus from, this weighted movement up, and we know that there's actually a larger force contraction requirement when we run downhill. So if we become a stronger athlete for that portion of the race, we're going to see better results, in the long term or the large scale. And I think that's what's
This
so
is
interesting about that work you're doing right now.
this is a really interesting concept that I mean, this is a slightly different rabbit hole right now, but I think I want to go down it because we often see things like Tom on, and Woodway is, I think, maybe the only treadmill that can be made to run backwards. But that's what you get when you have a, $15,000 treadmill. And so you're not going to be able to do this at your local gym. And not many people are going to have access to a Woodway treadmill. But we see things like that picture, that little video that Tom put on his Instagram, or we see other snapshots of what top athletes are doing, and people conflate that with that thinking, well, that's what they're doing that has made them successful. And I think I want to pop that bubble right now. It's no, it's the ability, as you just said, it's taken years to get Tom to the point where he can do that workout and see benefit from it. If you take someone who was of let's say, not as well trained as Tom is, and you put him into that, they will hurt themselves, and
Yeah.
that will be not only will not be beneficial to them, it will potentially be harmful to them to do training like that. And the first time I encountered this idea, I mean, we often see, I mean, it used to be really common when Runner's World magazine was an actual magazine that the cover article would be, you know, here's what so and so did for the last 6 weeks before they won the Chicago Marathon. And the implication being that, oh, you too should go do this because it will might not make you win the Chicago Marathon, but it will make you a faster runner. And that is so wrong. It's the fact that they could do that, whatever this, probably incredibly difficult amount of training was in those last 6 weeks. It's the fact that they could do that. And it's all the years that went before that got them to the point that they could do that training. That's what got them to win the Chicago Marathon, not those last 6 weeks. And some people might remember a podcast I did with Killian about a few years ago, the year that Tom was third at UTMB and Killian won that year. This was in 2021, I think. Killian has, as many people know, he has his own blog, and he published an article that year about the changes he'd made in his training, becoming a new father, and talked about he had reduced dramatically the volume of training he did and changed some of the types of training he was doing, and he'd had tremendous results in his races that year. And he published this article, but at the top of the article was a graph of his training volume for like the past 15 or so years. And you saw this massive volume. And then all of a sudden that year, the volume dropped dramatically. And there was all these, I mean, he had great results before that, of course, but there was this big drop in volume. And he had all these wonderful results that year in various lengths races, all the way up to 100 miles, like UTMB. And the blogosphere went crazy thinking, well, this is the secret. Just cut back on the volume of your training and you too will, have remarkable performance. And what people missed, and the reason, one of the things he and I talked about in that podcast, it's one of our podcasts, if people want to search through our podcast files, you'll be able to find it. I don't remember the number, but it was back in 2021. The thing they missed and that he and I talked about was no, it was those previous 15 years of training that allowed him to reduce his volume because he had such a huge base. It was like he tapered for an entire season, essentially, is what it was. And so I think that people miss the point that you can't mimic what a world-class athlete does and expect that this is what Killian's secret was this. And because the internet went wild that year there was so many ultra running podcasts talking about this is the new secret for, do what Killian did. And they missed that point completely. The first time I encountered this was in reading Peter Coe's book about training Sebastian Coe in 1980, when over about a 2-month period, Sebastian Coe broke every middle distance world record in 2 months. I think from the 800 to the 3000, somewhere in that range, over 2 months. And they talk about the workouts that he did leading into this world record spree. And the one workout was 45 times 200 meters. And the 200 meters were done, I think they started at 25 seconds and worked, or 27, and they worked down to 23 seconds per 200 with, a 100-meter walking recovery between them. And so the way that's when I talked about Runner's World would have said, here's the secret workout that allowed, Sebastian Coe to break all these world records. And no, what Peter Coe said is, this showed us that he was ready to go break those records. His ability to do this work, this amount of work, at this speed, in this short amount of time, was what told us, okay, now you're ready to go do it. So you can think of that with Tom on that Instagram post. The fact that Tom can do that work effectively, productively, shows me that he is now ready to go perform.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is probably the greatest fault of the social media training generation is seeing things in isolation and then saying, okay, I'll just do that and I'm going to be successful without understanding the underlying factors that brought someone there.
Yeah.
And it's a very short-sighted, opinion of watching training or applying training to yourself. I think that's where, we go back to some of our pillars of like, what is the least amount of work an athlete can do in order to see a positive physiological response, right? If you're just starting or you're years behind Tom, well, the least you can do to get a physiological response is not run downhill weighted right now, right?
Yeah.
There's other stuff we can do to set up that. Some of that stuff are these muscular endurance sets that allow us over time to develop the durability or the fatigue resistance to eventually be able to handle a different style of workout, that becomes a little bit or a higher level of stimulus, because now we need that higher level stimulus to drive adaptation across the body because we're deeper into those different muscle fiber types that require more and more activation in order to get that mitochondrial biogenesis activated and increase our aerobic capacity at a faster speed. And so I think, like you're saying, do not look at these things in isolation and say these are starting points or launching points. These are like arrival points. And also, I think in that there's a great lesson of, first the reason we treat things as discrete in training methodology at first is because if you can't get it right in the discrete, you can't get it right in the continuous. You can't pair things together and expect success if you can't do them in isolation first extremely well. And that's where, you cannot move up a mountain super well, especially weighted, if you can't even handle the weight on your back, right? If you put on the pack and your lats and your lower back are already fatigued, got news for you. We got other things we have to train before we get there. And those things then translate and transfer over into performance long term and become building blocks for, you know, Canova has an excellent protocol he did for years with guys where they would do tempo work on the track at second lactic threshold. They would then go do hill sprints. They would come back and do second lactic threshold work, go do hill sprints, come back, do second lactic threshold work in these monster workouts that turned into like cumulatively like 24 by 800 at marathon pace, broken into sets of 4 or 6 with hill sprints in between. Well, if you can't do hill sprints well in isolation and you can't run marathon pace well in isolation, you can never pair those two to now get this stimulus response that allows a world-class performance of, okay, I'm in the middle of a race running marathon pace and there's a surge up front and I have to cover it. Or for us mere mortals, I'm just running with a group and some guy's trying to break off the front and I want to go with them because I'm feeling good and feel like I can, run a personal best that day if I can just latch on. Well, most surges end in 2 or 3 minutes, and then we settle back into, a reliable pace. How do we train that? Well, we train that by doing these more continuous style workouts where I'm engaging several different stimuli in the same workout and then applying it, forward. But I don't start there. I get there over years or a long amount of time to arrive at that point when first I have to prove that I can do these things in isolation well before I bring them together and perform.
Yeah, when I right after the first that first book came out, Training for the New Alpinism, and I was mainly targeting mountaineers in that book. And I was giving lectures about it. I was using the example of the the head wall on Denali between the 14,000 foot camp to get up onto the West Buttress at about 16,000 feet. So there's this steep head wall. I mean, it's not steep from a climbing standpoint, but from kind of a mountaineering standpoint, it is. It involves just taking 2,000 feet of stepping up in what are kicked out steps because there's been so many people going up it. So it's like climbing a set of stairs, but each stair is about 16 inches tall. And you're doing this with a very heavy pack on your back. And the way to train for that would be, okay, I mean, in my gym, I'm going to put a 16-inch box in my gym and put a heavy pack on and step up on it. And what I was saying is, like, if you can't step up onto that box with, 60 or 70 pounds on your back one time, how are you ever going to climb this 2,000 foot snow ladder, essentially, with all these steps kicked into it? And so there's where, okay, your first limitation there is strength. We have to get you stronger first before we can worry about the muscular endurance side of that activity. So that's one of those ideas of looking for, okay, what's the weakness here? But yeah, this idea that people can suddenly leap into a world-class program and think it's going to give them results, and that's the secret is, and unfortunately promulgated by social media, just the media in general, because I still see headlines, what so and so did in 6 weeks before, setting a world record, and it's unfortunate because it downplays all the hard work that athlete had to do for a decade, maybe, to get to the point where they could do that kind of stuff. So putting all these pieces together, I hope people can come away from this discussion we've had today, Vince, of this idea of strength training for endurance athletes. It's one piece of the whole puzzle. It's something that has to fit into the training over the course of a long time. And that we feel, and I think we've proven through decades of using this, that this muscular endurance component, this at the junction of the aerobic system and the strength system coming together, that is a really key element, but it's just one element of that whole picture.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I would add for everybody that in training, if you experience training that for every reason throws out an entire tool set or an entire tool of capability that enables that dimmer switch, then we're missing a piece of training. And again, we're just talking about one small piece of it right now. But this can happen across a large spectrum of things. When we hear coaches say there is no reason that we could ever need that, uh, that is a difficult position to argue from. Why? Because you can look along the spectrum of performance and say, well, if the body is made of out of this thing that occurs across the spectrum and which is not discrete in nature, then we have to train the continuous system for performance. And so I would just, encourage everybody, use as many tools as you possibly can. And I tell my athletes all the time, if you use a tool and you see progression from it, then continue to use it. If we try a tool, for 8, 12, 16 weeks and we don't see progression from it, that's a whole different discussion. But attempt to use the tool, monitor your progress, see what the performance, benefit or indication is from it, and then make a decision on whether or not to keep that tool in your repertoire long term as something that you can use to defend against performance degradation over time.
That's a great way to wrap this up, Vince. Well, folks, I know you've had a long stint with us this morning. I really appreciate people bearing with us, having the endurance and the fatigue resistance to stick out this podcast. And thank you, Vince, for joining me. It's been great to have this kind of conversation. I know you and I have these often, so it's nothing new for us, but I hope people enjoyed listening in to this and got something out of it. And like Vince just said, the worst that can happen is you give this a try and it doesn't provide the results you're looking for. Although I would be highly surprised if that were to happen because I've done
It was
this for
shocked.
I've done this for 30 some years and it's worked every time. So well, good luck everybody. Thank you, Vince. Really appreciate your taking the time.
No, thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure.